Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The light faded earlier than usual that evening, dropping behind the tall bluffs like someone had pulled a curtain over the ridge, and the cold settled in fast. Jonas Mercer guided his tired horse along the hard ground, leading toward his cabin, the animal's hooves thudding in a slow, steady rhythm. Dust lifted around them in small, pale clouds each time the wind pushed in from a valley. Jonas kept his shoulders tense without realizing it, watching the land the same way he used to watch narrow trails during scouting years, eyes tracking movement, listening for sounds that didn't fit. At 38, his body carried the steady strength of ranch work, but the way he sat in the saddle showed more weariness than age. His coat was patched at the elbows, the wool shirt underneath faded from sun and winters. His jaw had a day's worth of stubble, and faint lines marked the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from lack of sleep and too many nights spent waiting for trouble that never arrived. He lived alone by choice. After leaving military life behind, he tried a few small towns but couldn't handle the noise or the crowds. So he came here, Dry Rock Ridge, a quiet stretch of land where a man could breathe without someone asking questions. His mission these days was simple: keep the fence lines checked, keep the cattle safe, keep the solitude steady. He trusted routines more than he trusted people. So when he rounded the last curve and saw someone standing near his porch, he felt a sharp jolt in his chest, a fast hit of alarm that made him pull the reins tighter. His horse reacted, lifting its head sharply, sensing his tension. Jonas kept his breathing controlled as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A woman stood in the fading light, thin and unsteady, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The first thing he noticed was that she was barefoot on the cold ground, her toes red from exposure. Her long black hair hung in uneven braids, some strands already loose and blowing across her face. Her bronze skin was scraped along the arms and legs, and her deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder, the rip running diagonally across it as if she'd been grabbed or caught on something while running. She tried to straighten her back when she saw him, but her legs trembled enough that she had to grip the porch post to stay upright. Even from a distance, Jonas could see her breathing was uneven and shallow, a quick rhythm that matched someone trying to hide fear, but failing. Tala had been on the run for 2 days before reaching this place. The forced marriage her band tried to impose on her pushed her to flee in the night, and the men who went after her didn't give her much time to rest. She had stayed off open roads, moved through brush, and traveled without food, stopping only when her legs refused to move. She reached the ranch because her body couldn't go farther. Jonas didn't know any of that yet, but he saw enough to guess she hadn't arrived here willingly. He slowed the horse to a stop. His heartbeat kicked faster, a familiar tension he thought he had buried years ago. His mind went over possibilities. Was she hurt? Was someone chasing her? Was this some sort of trap? He scanned the land carefully, checking for movement behind the sagebrush, checking the ridge for riders. Nothing, just a silent stretch of open space. When he looked back at her, she was staring at him with wide, exhausted eyes. Her jaw clenched like she was preparing to speak, but her words kept failing in her throat. Jonas swung his leg off the horse, landing with a heavy step. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't move fast. Fast movements scared people, and she already looked close to collapsing. She lifted her hands slightly, palms outward, not in surrender, but in an attempt to offer something before he could tell her to leave. "I can wash your clothes," she said, the words catching. "Cook, sweep, anything, if you let me stay, just for the night. I won't cause trouble." Her voice cracked at the end, the strain showing how close she was to breaking. She kept her gaze on the ground after speaking, ashamed to beg but too desperate to hide it. Jonas felt something tighten low in his chest. He wasn't a man who liked people offering to work for him. Debt made him uncomfortable. Bargains made things messy. But he could see her fingers shaking. He could see the way her ribs pressed tightly under the torn fabric when she breathed. She was freezing. She was starving. She was terrified. And he remembered nights when he, too, had stood alone in the dark, exhausted, unsure if he'd survive to sunrise. He didn't say much. Jonas rarely did. He opened his saddlebag, reached inside, and pulled out the folded wool blanket he kept for emergencies, usually for the horse, sometimes for himself when the stove died during winter storms. Without stepping too close, he held it out to her. "You don't owe me," he said, voice steady. She didn't answer right away. The confusion on her face was immediate. She wasn't used to someone giving without asking for something back. Her eyes flicked between his hand and the blanket, as if she feared he might snatch it away if she hesitated. After a long second, she reached forward and took it with both hands, gripping the fabric tightly against her chest. Her breathing changed, still fast, but less panicked, more controlled. Jonas stepped back and pushed the cabin door open. The hinges made a low groan. He didn't invite her with words. He simply stood to the side, giving her space to choose. Tala hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, moving slowly so her legs wouldn't give out beneath her. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old pine. A tin stove sat near the back wall, giving off faint heat. A small table stood near the window, and a bedroll was pushed against the far side. The room was plain, functional, nothing wasted and nothing decorative. Jonas walked in behind her and closed the door. The wind hit the wood a moment later, rattling it slightly, and she flinched at the sound. Her grip tightened on the blanket. She backed toward the stove, stopping only when her calves touched the stool next to it. Jonas removed his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. He kept his voice low. "Sit. Warm up." She did, slowly lowering herself onto the stool. Her feet curled inward on the floor, trying to absorb whatever warmth she could. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the fire, watching it the way someone watches a lifeline. Jonas checked the window latch, pushing it down an extra time. He wasn't checking because of her. He was checking because he always did, but he noticed her watching him anyway, studying the way he moved with cautious attention. Inside her mind, Tala fought the urge to apologize for being here. She didn't know if she should stay silent or speak again. Every instinct told her to be small, quiet, invisible. She didn't know what kind of man Jonas was, if he would change his mind, if he was just waiting to decide what she was worth. Inside his mind, Jonas kept turning the situation over. He didn't trust strangers. He didn't need anyone here. But he couldn't send her out into the cold. That wasn't something he could live with. The room stayed quiet except for the crack of wood in the stove and the wind outside. Two people, both carrying their own pasts, both unsure what came next, shared the same space for the first time. Jonas finally poured warm broth from a pot over the stove and set it on the table near her hand. She looked at it, then at him. He stepped back, giving her space. The moment was small, but shifted everything. Tala lifted the cup with both hands and drank carefully, feeling the heat steady her breath. Jonas sat on the other side of the room, close enough to watch over her without crowding her, and waited for the night to settle. The fear in her shoulders softened, little by little. And in that quiet, the beginning of their bond took root, built not from words but from the choice he made and the trust she gave in return. The wind picked up after nightfall, pushing against the thin walls of the cabin and making the door tremble in its frame. Tala shifted on the stool, tightening the blanket around her shoulders while her feet curled toward the stove. The heat helped, but the cold had sunk deep in her bones and would take hours to leave. Jonas watched her from across the room, leaning slightly forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. He wasn't staring. He was assessing her condition, her fear level, and whether she was strong enough to stay conscious. A few minutes passed before she looked up, her voice barely above breath. "Do you live alone?" "Yes," Jonas answered. He didn't feel the need to add more. She hesitated before asking, "For how long?" "Years." Tala nodded as if she had expected that. She lowered her eyes again, sensing from his short tone that pushing for details would shut him down. Still, she wanted to understand the man who had let her inside without demanding anything. Her fingers rubbed the edge of the blanket, grounding herself. Jonas stood and moved to the stove to stir the pot again. The small motion made her flinch, not dramatically, just a quick, sharp tightening in her shoulders. He slowed his movements even more. "You're safe here," he said, not looking at her, but keeping his voice steady. She nodded once. but her body didn't fully believe him yet. After a moment, he poured more broth into the cup and set it on the table near her. Drink. She wrapped both hands around the cup and lifted it carefully. The warmth touched her face when the steam rose. Thank you, she whispered. Jonas responded with a small nod. He didn't want her to feel indebted. He didn't want gratitude to become obligation. But he recognized that saying nothing in this moment would have made him seem cold, so he allowed the nod. While she drank in small sips, Jonas checked the windows again. He pushed lightly against the frame of each one, making sure it held. Tala followed his movements with slow, deliberate turns of her head. You keep checking, she said quietly. Habit. For what? Anything that doesn't belong out there. She absorbed that, understanding more about him through that short answer than he expected her to. He wasn't paranoid. He was practiced. A man who had survived enough trouble to anticipate it before others noticed the signs. Tala shifted, wincing slightly when the blanket brushed her ribs. Jonas saw her breath catch and paused. Those bruises? She lowered her eyes. I ran into a tree branch. Or a rock. I don't remember all of it. He didn't believe the explanation, but he didn't challenge it. Her voice gave away more than her words did. He watched her a moment longer. She was trying not to tremble, but her body was too worn down to hide the exhaustion. Jonas set aside the pot and walked to the corner where his extra bedding was stacked. You can sleep near the stove, he said. Floor's warmer there. I can sleep anywhere, she answered quickly, almost defensive, as if she feared being a burden. I know, he replied, but you'll warm faster there. He spread the blanket on the floor. Tala stood slowly, careful not to reveal how much pain she was in, and moved toward it with measured steps. When she lowered herself down, she kept her knees pulled close under the blanket, eyes flicking around the room as if mapping every exit. Jonas blew out the smaller lantern and dimmed the room until only the orange glow from the stove lit the walls. He set his own bedroll farther back, near the cabin wall. The distance was deliberate, reassuring, respectful, protective. He lay down but stayed half awake, scanning the shadows. Tala sensed he was alert even while lying still. Minutes stretched. Wind pushed against the roof, making it creak. Tala shifted once, twice, unable to settle. She whispered into the dim light, her voice thin from fear she was trying to swallow. Are you going to ask anything of me? Jonas turned his head slightly, not rising, not approaching, just answering. No. She took in a slow breath that shook a little. Why help me then? He thought about the question longer than expected. Images flickered through his mind. Winter marches, wounded scouts he couldn't save, the sound of a young man calling for help during a raid he still couldn't forget. He pushed the memories back and answered simply. You're cold. That's reason enough. Tala stared at the fire after that. Her expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. She lay down fully then, tucking the blanket beneath her chin. Her breathing stayed shallow at first, but slowly, as the warmth built and her ribs loosened, her body eased into a calmer rhythm. Jonas kept his eyes on the door a while longer. The marks on her skin, the way she had been trembling on the porch, the rapid way she looked over her shoulder. Someone had chased her, and he didn't need her to admit it to know it was true. He listened to the wind, listened for hoofbeats, listened for anything that might follow her here. Nothing came. Only the steady sound of Tala's breathing as she finally drifted towards sleep, still tense, still guarded, but sheltered for the first time in days. Jonas allowed himself to close his eyes after that, the decision made silently in his mind. She would stay. She needed safety, and he would keep watch. Not because he owed her, not because she owed him, but because in this cold land, people survived only when someone decided not to walk away. The fire burned low by the time the moon rose. The stove's glow lit the small cabin in weak orange light, casting steady warmth around the front of the room, but leaving the corners dark. Tala lay curled near the stove, wrapped tightly in the wool blanket Jonas had given her. She wasn't fully asleep. Her breathing shifted between shallow and ragged, the kind that comes when someone is too tired to stay awake but too afraid to let go completely. Jonas rested on his bedroll near the far wall, lying on his back with one arm under his head. His eyes stayed open longer than needed, adjusting to every shadow, tracking each sound outside. The wind against the roof, a loose shutter tapping the wall, the distant call of a night bird. Nothing unusual, but he listened anyway. Years of scouting didn't leave a man, even when he tried to put distance between himself and the past. Tala stirred. A quiet whimper escaped before she caught herself. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. Jonas sat up slightly. "You awake?" She didn't answer right away. Her breath wavered as she tried to control it. Finally, in a voice that barely reached him, she said, "I hear them sometimes. Well, I'm tired. The ones chasing me." He didn't move closer. He knew better than to corner someone already scared. "It's just the wind out there," he said. "I know," she whispered, "but my body still thinks it's them." Jonas understood that feeling too well, more than he wanted to admit. He stayed in his place, elbows resting on his knees, and let his voice stay steady. "You're inside now. No one's getting through this door without me knowing." Tala nodded, but her body stayed tight. Her eyes kept flicking between the stove and the windows, as if she expected something to appear in the glass. She shifted again, wincing as her ribs pulled. Jonas noticed her hand drifting to her side, trying to apply pressure without drawing attention to it. "How bad are your ribs?" he asked. "They hurt," she answered honestly, "but they're only bruised." "How long have you had them?" "Since yesterday morning." That explained the uneven breathing, the way she kept trying to sit straighter than her body could manage. He considered offering to bind the injury, but he didn't know how she'd react to being touched. Instead, he said quietly, "We'll look at it in the morning, when the light's better." She didn't argue, which told him the pain was worse than she wanted him to know. The wind hit the door hard again. Tala flinched so sharply that the blanket slipped from her shoulder. She reached for it quickly, but Jonas saw her fingers trembling. "You want the lantern lit?" he asked. "No, the dark is fine." Her answer was unconvincing, but she didn't want to seem afraid. He stayed sitting up, watching the door for a long moment, listening. Nothing but wind. Nothing but the settling of the cabin timbers. "You get any sleep outside before you found this place?" he asked. "Not really," she murmured. "Every sound kept me awake. I thought if I stopped listening, they'd find me." Her voice shook at the end, and she pressed her lips together, trying to steady herself. She didn't want him to think she was weak. Jonas understood that too. Fear that made you want to appear stronger than your body allowed. After a moment, he said, "You can sleep here. I'll stay up a while." Tala looked over, surprised by the offer. She shifted her weight, part fear, part relief. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he replied. "But I will." Her eyes lingered on him, trying to understand why a stranger would choose to watch over her without conditions. She found no answer, but she also found no threat in his face. She lay down again, pulling the blanket higher, her breathing still uneven but slower now. Minutes passed. Then she whispered something so faint he almost missed it. "I didn't mean to come here. I didn't know anyone lived on this land." "You came where your legs brought you." "I thought maybe I'd made a mistake." "You didn't," he said simply. The words settled the air between them. Tala finally closed her eyes. Jonas stayed awake long after her breathing softened. His mind drifted to the ambush in his scouting days, to the men he couldn't save, to the reason he chose a quiet cabin far from anyone. He pushed those thoughts down when they grew too loud. As the fire dimmed further, he rose carefully, added a small log to keep the room warm, and returned to his bedroll. She didn't wake, but she shifted slightly, her fear loosening by inches. For the first time all night, she seemed like her body might allow real sleep. Jonas lay on his side, facing the door, one hand close to the floor where his rifle leaned. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he wasn't taking chances either. The night pressed on, cold and long, yet something in the cabin had already changed. Two people who were strangers hours ago now shared the same silence. One sleeping because she trusted he would keep watch, and one staying awake because he had silently agreed to. The first light came in quietly, slipping through the patched window in a thin gray beam. The stove had burned low during the night, leaving only warm embers glowing faintly beneath the iron door. Cold air pressed against the cabin again, the kind that made breath show with each exhale. Jonas opened his eyes before the sun fully crested the ridge. He had slept only in short stretches, waking every time the wind changed direction or a branch snapped outside. He pushed himself up slowly, listening first, always listening. The yard was still. No hoofbeats, no footsteps, no voices carried by the morning air. Tala hadn't moved much during the night. She lay curled near the stove, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the other gripping the blanket loosely. Even in sleep, her brow stayed tight, as if the weight of the last few days wouldn't give her peace. Jonas watched her for a moment, not out of curiosity, but out of caution, checking her breathing, making sure her body hadn't slipped into shock after exhaustion. When he stepped quietly outside, the cold hit him harder than expected. Frost coated the grass and rail posts in a pale layer. The sky was dull, low clouds stretched across the ridge. He walked around the cabin perimeter, studying the ground. His eyes narrowed slightly when he spotted faint depressions in the dirt near the far edge of his property. Boot tracks. Old? No, not older than a day. Maybe two. Too faint to tell direction with certainty, but enough to raise alertness in his chest. He took a slow breath and scanned the horizon again. Nothing moved. When he returned inside, Tala was awake, though she hadn't moved from her spot. She was watching the door, stiffened by instinct the moment she heard it open. Jonas shut it behind him gently. "You're up." She nodded. "The cold woke me." Her voice was rough from sleep. She pushed herself slowly to sit, but the motion caused her to wince sharply. Her hand pressed against her ribs. "Let me see," Jonas said, lowering himself into a crouch near the stove. She shook her head. "It's fine. I'll manage. You're hurting. Let me look." The firmness in his tone didn't leave room for argument. Still, she hesitated. Being examined, being touched, felt dangerous after days of running from men who saw her as something to take, not protect. She swallowed, steadying herself, and lifted the corner of the blanket slightly, revealing dark bruising beneath the torn fabric of her dress. The skin was swollen in uneven lines, the kind caused by falling or by being grabbed hard. Jonas studied the injury without touching her at first. His jaw tightened. "That from running?" he asked. Her eyes flicked away. She didn't answer. He understood enough. He reached for a strip of clean cloth from a small crate near his bedroll. "I'll wrap it. Hold still." She braced herself. Jonas placed his hands carefully on her side, moving with slow precision. His touch was firm enough to support the injury, but cautious enough not to frighten her. She held her breath once, then let it go slowly when she realized he wasn't hurting her. "You're lucky nothing's cracked," Jonas said quietly. "You keep moving too fast, it will. I won't be here long enough to make it worse." Her tone was defensive, as if she expected him to tell her to leave. He tied the ends of the cloth neatly. "You're not leaving today." "Why? You can't walk far." "You know that." Tala lowered her gaze. "I didn't plan to stay anywhere. I thought if I kept moving, I'd be safe." Jonas sat back on his heels. "Running doesn't always keep you ahead." "I know," but stopping felt worse. There was no accusation in her voice, only tired honesty. Jonas stood and walked to the table to pour water from a tin jug. His hands were steady, but his mind was turning over what he'd found outside. If someone was following her, they could return. Tracks faded quickly in this land, but they didn't appear for no reason. He handed her the cup. "Drink." She took it, sipping slowly. Her fingers trembled from how cold they still were. Jonas leaned against the edge of the table. "You said you were chased." Her grip tightened around the cup. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Silence hung in the air. She looked at him, weighing whether to trust him with more. Her eyes softened slightly, but she wasn't ready yet. Instead, she said, "Do you want me gone when I can stand? Do you want your home back the way it was?" Jonas studied her face, deep eyes still shadowed from fear. Posture trying to be straight despite pain, hands gripping the blanket because letting go meant showing weakness. "No," he said plainly. "I want you warm. I want you healed. After that, it's your choice." Her expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but a slow loosening of the tension locked across her shoulders. It was the first time in days someone had given her a choice instead of an order. He stepped back and reached for his coat. "I'll check the lower fence again. Make sure the tracks I saw don't lead closer." Her eyes widened. Someone came here? Not last night, but someone passed the far end of the property. Could be nothing. Could be something. Fear flickered across her face. She stood too fast and immediately winced from the pain in her ribs. Jonas lifted a hand, not touching her, just signaling for her to sit. "You're safe here," he said. "No one's coming through that door without me knowing." Tala swallowed hard and sat again, pulling the blanket around her body as if sealing warmth and trust together. Jonas stepped outside, closing the door softly behind him. She listened to his footsteps fade toward the corral, the quiet confidence in his movements somehow more reassuring than the words he'd spoken. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled as the new piece of wood caught fire. Tala watched the door, her heart still unsteady, but for the first time since she fled her band, she no longer felt completely alone. She didn't know what the day would bring, but she knew this. For the moment, she had shelter, and someone who wasn't waiting to decide her fate, only to protect it. The sun rose higher than it had in days, though its warmth barely reached the ground. A dull light spread across Jonas's small yard, touching the corral, the patch of dry grass, the weather-beaten fence, and the ground where faint tracks had been only hours earlier. Jonas saw them clearly now, shallow depressions, the edges softened by frost but still readable. One person, maybe two, passing through or searching. He couldn't know yet. He crouched to study them, jaw set, the cold seeping through his gloves. He had seen enough trailing signs in his scouting years to know when someone was moving with purpose. Whoever made these tracks hadn't wandered. Their steps were too measured. He stood slowly, the old tension settling between his shoulders. The decision formed in his mind without needing to speak it. He would work as usual, but stay alert. Someone might return, and Tala needed safety more than distance. When he walked back toward the cabin, he saw her through the small window, sitting at the table with the blanket wrapped around her like a second skin. She held herself stiffly, trying not to show discomfort. Her eyes were lowered, following the small movements of her hands as she rubbed them together for warmth. Jonas stepped inside. She looked up immediately. "You were gone long," she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice carried a quiet strain. "Just checking the line," Jonas replied. "Fence looks good." She watched him hang his coat, searching his face for signs of unusual worry. She didn't find any. He was too practiced at keeping his emotions steady, but she sensed something in the way he moved, a slight heaviness in his steps, the way his eyes flicked toward the windows before he sat. "I can help," she said suddenly, as if the words escaped before she could think through them. "With what?" he asked, not dismissive, just curious. "Anything you need," she said. "Sweeping, preparing food, washing. I don't want to sit here while you work." "You should rest," Jonas said. "Your ribs need time. I can still help." Her tone was firmer now, an edge of determination coming through. "If I don't do something, my thoughts keep running, and I don't want to think about what might be outside." Jonas considered that. He understood the need to stay busy. Silence could be more dangerous than noise when a person's mind started pulling at old wounds. He nodded once. "All right, small tasks only. Nothing that makes your ribs worse." She stood carefully and moved toward the corner where he kept his supplies. He watched her pick up the broom. She held it with both hands, steadying herself, then began sweeping the dust along the edges of the floor. Her movements were slow, deliberate, controlled. Each pull of the broom strained her ribs, but she hid the pain behind a focused expression. "You don't need to push so hard," Jonas said from the table as he checked the rifle. "I'm not," she answered quickly, though she clearly was. Jonas didn't argue. He knew pride when he saw it. He wiped down the barrel, the cloth moving smoothly over the metal, but his eyes tracked her every few seconds. She kept her back straight and her chin up, trying not to appear fragile. He respected that, even if it wasn't necessary here. After sweeping, she moved to the small shelf by the stove and began organizing the few items Jonas had there. Tin cups, a small pot, dried herbs he rarely used. Her hand slipped once, and she caught herself on the stove's edge, breathing through a spike of pain. Jonas set the rifle aside, stood, and walked over slowly. "That's enough," he said quietly. "I can do more," she insisted. "You've already done enough." His tone wasn't commanding. It was steady, calm, almost gentle. Tala hesitated, then let her shoulders relax. She stepped back, placing the broom against the wall. "Fine," she whispered, "but I need something to do. I can't just sit." Jonas nodded toward the table. "Food, then. You can help with that." She moved toward the small pot and began preparing broth with cautious hands. Jonas fetched water from the jug, pouring it slowly to avoid spilling. Tala worked beside him, both of them moving quietly but not tense, just unfamiliar with sharing space. The smell of warm broth filled the room, easing some of the morning chill. When the food was ready, Jonas gestured for her to sit first. She hesitated but obeyed. He sat across from her, watching her take small sips. Her hand still trembled slightly, but she steadied them by holding the cup firmly. After a few minutes, she spoke, her voice softer. "You didn't tell me what you saw outside." Jonas looked up. "You weren't ready to hear it earlier." "I'm ready now." "Just tracks," he said. "Faint. Could be nothing." "Or it could be them," she whispered. Jonas didn't answer right away. He chose his words carefully. "If they were close, you'd have heard them before you reached my porch. The land carries sound. You came alone." Her eyes lowered. "Not because they stopped. Because I ran faster." He studied her face, seeing the exhaustion beneath the determination. She looked like someone who had been stretching herself beyond her limit for too long. "You're safe here," Jonas said. "Nothing's getting past me." Tala held his gaze. Something changed in her expression then. Not trust yet, but the beginning of letting herself believe what he said. She finished her cup slowly. Jonas cleared the bowls and rinsed them in the basin. She watched him work, her eyes steady and thoughtful. "How long will you let me stay?" she asked quietly. "As long as you need," he answered, not looking away from his task. The words settled in her chest, filling a space that had been empty for too long. She lowered her head, hiding the emotion tightening her throat. Jonas finished cleaning the bowls and set them to dry. "We'll take the day slow," he said. "I'll work outside. You stay in. Keep warm." Tala nodded. She didn't argue. As Jonas stepped out into the yard, Tala watched the door close behind him. For the first time since fleeing her band, she didn't feel the urge to run. Instead, she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, stepped closer to the fire, and allowed herself to breathe in a deeper, steadier way. Outside, Jonas walked the fence line again, more alert than before. Inside, Tala swept her hand across the table, smoothing the wood grain with quiet focus. For the first time since their paths crossed, the cabin felt less like a place of escape, and more like a place where something steady might take root. Before noon, the light dimmed again. A bank of clouds moved in from the west, heavy enough to dull the colors of the land and make the wind drop lower across the ground with a soft whistle. Jonas finished repairing a loose rail in the corral and wiped the dust from his hands. He paused, scanning the ridge once more. The tracks he had seen earlier still pressed on his mind. Faint, yes, but real. Not animal. Not wandering. Human. Someone walking the far edge of his property, close enough to matter. He didn't want Tala to know how much it unsettled him, but he knew she would sense it anyway. She was too alert, too quick to notice small changes in him. When Jonas stepped onto the porch, he found Tala standing by the window, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her posture rigid. She turned sharply when the door opened, tension tightening her jaw. "You were gone too long," she said, breath quickened. "Just checking the ridge again." He removed his gloves and hung them near the door. Nothing pushed closer. Her gaze searched his face. But something was there. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to control it. Jonas didn't lie. There were tracks, old enough to be softened, but someone passed through. Her fingers curled hard around the blanket. Did they look like someone searching? Could have been, Jonas said. Could have been someone moving through. Hard to know. She turned toward the stove, trying to steady her breaths. The fear didn't show in her face so much as in the way she held her body, stiff, waiting for a blow or a shout. She had lived too long, expecting the worst from others. Jonas stepped closer to the table and kept his tone level. You're safe in here. Her eyes lifted slowly. Until when? As long as I'm in this cabin, he said, no one touches you. Something flickered in her expression. Uncertainty, disbelief, then something else, something almost like relief before she forced it down. Tala pulled the blanket tighter and leaned against the wall near the stove. I didn't think they'd follow this far, she whispered. Jonas didn't press for details. Instead, he waited. People always spoke when they needed to. After a long silence, she exhaled sharply. They weren't all from my band, she said. Some are traitors. Men who trade people when they don't pay debts. I don't know who they were angry at. My band or me. Maybe both. Jonas tasted bitterness in the back of his throat. He had seen men like that during his scouting days. Men who used fear the way others used weapons. Do they know your band? Force the marriage? Jonas asked. They don't care, she whispered. Trouble is trouble. They like excuses. She lifted a hand to her ribs, pressing gently. Jonas noticed the strain in her shoulders and stepped closer to the stove to add wood. You're warm enough? He asked. She nodded, though her hands betrayed a faint tremble. When he sat beside the table, Tala looked at him again, longer this time, studying his calm posture, his unhurried movements, the steadiness in his expression. You don't get frightened easily, she said. Jonas shrugged once. Frightened, no. Careful, yes. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the old tension gather again. Lost people once, he said finally. Good people. I didn't move fast enough. After that, I pay attention. Tala watched him quietly. Sadness softened her features, not pity, understanding. I'm sorry, she murmured. Past is past, Jonas replied. I stay ready. That's all. The stove hissed as a log settled. Outside, the wind shifted direction. Tala instinctively flinched, her eyes going to the window again. Jonas saw. Sit, he said gently. You're wearing yourself thin, watching the door. She hesitated, then moved to the stool slowly. Her steps were careful, mostly from pain, partly from fear she didn't want to name. When she sat, she pulled the blanket around her arms but didn't look away from the window. Jonas took a breath, made a decision, and walked to the door. I'll show you something. Tala tensed. What? Just outside. Stay behind me. She stood, gripping the blanket tightly, following him with small, uneven steps. When he opened the door, the cold bit at their faces, and she stayed close to the wall while looking out cautiously. Jonas pointed toward the open land stretching past the corral. Look there. Tracks run that way. She swallowed hard. That's toward my old band's trail. And look there, Jonas said, pointing farther west. No tracks that way. No sign of campfires. No horses. If people were close, the ridge would carry the echo. Tala listened. The valley was silent except for the low wind brushing the grass. You hear anything? Jonas asked. No, she whispered. You hear nothing because no one's out there. Her shoulders loosened just a fraction. Some of the fear in her expression faded. He let her take her time, let her scan the horizon until her breathing steadied again. Then he stepped back inside, holding the door for her, and she followed without him needing to urge her. Back in the warmth of the cabin, she exhaled deeply, almost shaking. I thought they would never stop, she said. I thought every step I took, they were right behind me. You're not running now, Jonas replied. Her gaze flicked up. And you're not running either. He met her eyes. I don't run from things anymore. The silence that followed wasn't the fearful kind. It was heavier, but warmer. Two people who didn't want to say what they were both thinking. They had started depending on each other. Tala lowered herself onto the stool again. Jonas moved near the stove to check the pot. Their movements settled into a rhythm, quiet, steady, shared. For the first time since arriving, Tala didn't stare at the door every few seconds. And Jonas, without fully admitting it, had decided something important. He would not let anyone take her. Not while she healed. Not while she lived under his roof. Not while she stayed. By the time the afternoon settled in, the sky had turned a flat pale color, the kind that warned of colder hours ahead. Jonas had spent the last few hours moving between small chores, splitting wood, checking the barn latch, making sure nothing in the yard looked disturbed. He worked steadily, but without his usual quiet ease. Every time he finished one task, he checked the ridge again, then the fence, then the northern slope. Tala watched him from the window, her hands wrapped in the blanket. She knew enough about reading a man's posture to tell when someone's mind wasn't calm. Jonas kept his back straight, but his shoulders held tension, the kind that gathered before trouble or after too much thinking. She stepped away from the window and sat carefully, her ribs protesting each movement. After a few minutes, the door opened and Jonas came in, carrying a small bundle of fresh kindling. "You've been out there a long time," she said. He set the kindling beside the stove. "Sun's dropping sooner. Cold's coming fast." "You didn't answer what I meant," she said quietly. Jonas paused, the kind of pause that meant he was deciding how much truth to give. "There's no new tracks," he said, "but I'm not taking chances." Tala lowered her eyes. Guilt pressed in her chest. "You're doing all this because of me." "I'd do it for anyone being chased," he replied. "And you're not trouble. You're someone who needed help." She swallowed hard. "Most men don't help for nothing." "I'm not most men," Jonas said with a slight shake of his head. Silence stretched between them. The kind that didn't feel sharp or heavy, but full of things neither one knew how to say aloud. Tala shifted on the stool and drew a sharp breath when her ribs pulled. Jonas reacted immediately, stepping closer. "Let me look again," he said. The wrap might have slipped. She stiffened out of instinct, then forced herself to nod. "All right." Jonas crouched beside her. His hands moved slowly, giving her time to see what he was doing. He untied the cloth gently. When the fabric loosened, she winced from the pressure release, letting out a quiet, shaky breath. "Sorry," he murmured. "It's fine," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Her ribs were bruised across one side. The skin darkened in uneven patches. Jonas studied the injury with a focused calm, but inside he felt anger, quiet, controlled, but real. Someone had done this to her. Someone had forced her into a life she fled in fear. "You ran hard," he said. "I had to." He dipped a clean cloth into warm water and wrung it out, then pressed it gently against her side. The warmth made her eyes close for a moment, a soft sound leaving her throat. Not pain, just relief. Jonas froze for half a heartbeat, then continued carefully, placing the cloth along the bruises. "You've had these for days," he said. "You've been breathing shallow this whole time." "It hurt too much to breathe deep," she admitted. "If I did, it'd slow me down." He frowned, not at her, but at the idea of her running through cold nights with broken breath and no food. "Hold still," he said quietly. His hands wrapped the cloth around her torso again, pulling it snug but not tight. His fingertips brushed lightly against her skin each time he adjusted the band, and Tala forced herself to stay calm. Every instinct told her to flinch or retreat, old reflexes from too many hands that hadn't been gentle. But Jonas moved with care, steady and patient, and something inside her slowly unclenched. When he tied the final knot, she whispered, "You're very careful." "I'm not here to hurt you." "I know," she said quickly. "It's just strange, being treated gently." Jonas looked up at her. For a moment, the weight in his expression softened. "You deserve better than what happened to you." Her breath caught. She didn't know how to answer that. No one had ever said something like it to her without wanting something in return. Jonas stood and stepped back, giving her space. "You should try to walk a bit," he said. "Not far, just enough to keep the stiffness from settling." She rose slowly, one hand on the table for balance. Jonas stayed near her, not touching her, not offering help unless she asked, but close enough that she wouldn't fall. She took a few careful steps across the room. Her movements were small, her ribs sending sharp signals with every shift. But she pushed through it. "Good," he said. "Keep breathing steady." She nodded, though sweat gathered at her temples from the effort. When she reached the stove again, she leaned against the wall lightly. "You know," she said quietly, "I thought men like you didn't exist." "Men who wrap ribs?" he asked. "Men who don't want something the moment they help." Jonas studied her a moment, his face unreadable. "I want one thing," he said finally. Her chest tightened. What? For you to heal up. That's it. She looked down to hide the emotion rising in her eyes. Jonas stepped away to give her space, but he didn't leave the room. He pretended to busy himself with firewood, though he kept his gaze on her from the corner of his eye, protective without being intrusive. Tala stood there, breathing slowly, letting his words settle inside her. Jonas Mercer had already changed the shape of her fear without touching her heart, and she didn't know where it would lead. But she knew this much. When he wrapped her ribs, she felt something she hadn't felt since long before the chase. Safe enough to breathe. The next morning came with a sharper cold, the kind that clung to the ground even after the sun started its slow climb. Frost coated the edges of the window, tracing thin white lines across the glass. Tala sat close to the stove with a blanket around her shoulders, breathing carefully through the pressure of the wrap Jonas had tied around her ribs. The ache hadn't vanished, but it no longer burned with every breath. She could move now without fearing the next step would drop her to her knees. Jonas stepped in from outside, brushing dirt and cold air from his coat. He held a small sack of potatoes he'd dug from the storage pit. When he saw her awake, he paused, studying her posture, the tension in her jaw. "How's the pain?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Not good, just better." "That's all right," Jonas replied, setting the potatoes on the table. Healing isn't fast. She watched him quietly while he washed his hands. He moved with the same steady discipline he had since she arrived. No rush, no wasted motion. She found herself memorizing the rhythm of him. She wasn't sure when she'd started doing that. Jonas set a pan on the stove and handed her one of the smaller potatoes. "Think you can peel it?" She took it, fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. A flicker of warmth shot up her arm. Unexpected, unwelcome, but real. She looked down immediately, hiding the reaction. Jonas didn't show any sign he felt anything, but he lingered a half-second longer than necessary before pulling his hand back. She peeled slowly, careful not to strain her ribs. Jonas chopped the peeled potatoes with quiet precision, the knife tapping steadily against the cutting board. The sound was almost comforting. "Sleep all right?" he asked. Tala hesitated. "Some. I woke a few times." "You didn't cry out like before." "I tried not to." "You don't have to try here," he said, not looking up from the knife. "Pain is pain. It doesn't embarrass me." Tala's breath caught. She wasn't used to a man separating weakness from shame, a moment that nearly breaks her. As they worked, she suddenly paused and pressed a hand to her ribs, breathing in sharply. Jonas noticed instantly. "Sit," he said. "I'm fine," she insisted, trying to straighten. Jonas stepped closer, not touching her, but standing near enough to steady her with his presence alone. "Sit," he repeated. "You're overdoing it." The firmness in his voice, combined with the gentleness behind it, cut through her instinct to resist. She sat. Jonas crouched beside her again, checking the wrap with the same care he'd shown the day before. His fingers brushed her side lightly, and she didn't flinch this time. In fact, she found herself leaning slightly toward him before she caught the motion and froze. Jonas noticed, but he didn't react. He simply adjusted the cloth and stepped back. "You're pushing too hard," he said softly. "I don't want to look useless." "You're not useless," he replied. "You're injured." She lowered her gaze, embarrassed. "My band didn't care about that difference." He lifted his chin, meeting her eyes directly. "I'm not your band." The room went quiet. Tala swallowed, trying to steady herself. Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, the lack of judgment, hit her harder than pain ever had. A walk and a decision. After breakfast, Jonas opened the cabin door. "Come outside. A little air will help your lungs." Tala hesitated. "Is it safe?" "If there was danger near, I wouldn't ask you." She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit immediately, but the light helped. The ground stretched in long, open lines toward the hills. No movement, no tracks, no threat she could see. Jonas stood beside her, arms crossed, scanning the land automatically. She watched his profile for a moment, the hard lines softened by winter light, the early gray at his temples, the steady way he breathed. "What will you do if they come?" she asked quietly. Handle it, he answered. Ow! However I need to. Tala took a shaky breath. Jonas, if they find me here, it could bring trouble to you. That's not your burden to carry. She stared at him, shock tightening her throat. No one has ever said that to me. You don't bring trouble, Jonas said. People chasing you do. That's on them. A gust of wind pushed against the porch. Tala pulled the blanket tighter. Jonas moved a little closer, so his body blocked the worst of the cold, not touching her but standing deliberately between her and the wind. After a long pause, she whispered, I don't know when I'm supposed to leave. You're not, Jonas said, eyes still on the land. Not unless you want to. Her breath hitched. You mean, I can stay, as long as you choose. Tala blinked hard, emotions stinging behind her eyes. She wasn't a woman who cried easily, and she refused to let the tears fall now. But she felt a shift inside her, small but deep, like her body finally recognized that she wasn't running anymore. I don't want to leave, she said, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. Jonas turned his head, meeting her eyes. He nodded once, slow, accepting, not surprised. Then stay, he said simply. No deal, no price, just a choice. Hers. The moment stretched, warm despite the cold. And Tala realized something that frightened her more than the men who chased her. She trusted him, not because he saved her, not because he sheltered her, but because for the first time in years, someone let her decide the shape of her own life. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled again. Jonas held the door for her, and she stepped inside willingly, not out of desperation, but because she wanted to. For the first time in both their lives, staying didn't feel like giving up. It felt like the start of something she wasn't ready to name yet, but she already felt herself leaning toward it. The days that followed settled into a quiet pattern, the kind that shaped itself naturally without either of them planning it. Jonas checked the ridge each morning, walking slow, scanning the land with a practiced eye. The tracks from before faded completely, covered by frost and wind. No new ones appeared. Each morning Tala tested her steps, moving farther around the cabin, breathing deeper as her ribs healed. She still wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, but her movements grew steadier, more confident. When she walked now, she no longer glanced over her shoulder every few seconds. Jonas noticed, and the sight eased something in him he hadn't realized was tight. The inside of the cabin began to change too, barely at first. Tala organized the shelves, folded the blankets neatly, moved the tin cups where they were easier to reach. None of it was intrusive. She did it the way a person acts when trying to be respectful of another space. But Jonas found himself appreciating every small change she made. He never mentioned it, but she noticed the way he looked at the shelves sometimes, noticing their new order. One evening, as the stove warmed the room and the wind died down outside, Tala sat at the table slicing potatoes with slow precision while Jonas mended a torn glove. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. The silence felt easy. When she finished, she set the knife down carefully and rested her hands on the table. Jonas, she said, voice softer than usual. He lifted his eyes, waiting. I've been thinking, she continued, about leaving here. And I realized I don't want to. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink too fast, just watched her calmly. She swallowed. Not because I can't, because I don't want to. Jonas set the glove down. His expression didn't shift into surprise or hesitation. He just breathed in slowly, a quiet acceptance settling in him. You don't have to go, he said. You're not in danger here, and you're not taking up space I want back. Tala's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the kind of relief that comes from hearing something she'd been afraid to ask. When I ran, she whispered, I didn't think I'd find a place where I was allowed to stay. You've earned your place, Jonas replied. Then, gentler, you don't need to earn anything with me. She lowered her gaze, trying to steady the emotion rising inside her. If I stay, what happens next? Jonas stood and moved closer to her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. That depends on what you want. I want. She stopped, breath catching. It was difficult for her to speak freely. Too many years of choices being taken from her. She tried again. I want to build something, a life that doesn't depend on fear, and I want to build it with you." Jonas's jaw tightened, not from discomfort, but from the depth of what she was offering. He stepped even closer, watching her with steady eyes. "Are you asking to stay here?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she whispered. "As my partner?" She nodded, breath trembling. "If you'll have me." Jonas lifted a hand slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but the meaning behind it was certain. "Tala, you're already part of this place," he said. "Part of my days. Part of the quiet. I don't want you to leave." She exhaled shakily. Her ribs still hurt, but nothing inside her felt heavy anymore. He stepped closer until they shared the same breath. For the first time, he allowed himself to show what he'd been holding back: relief, hope, something warmer that felt almost foreign after years of keeping distance. Tala placed her hand gently over his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath her palm. Jonas didn't move away. He covered her hand with his, holding it there. "Will you stay by choice?" he asked. "Yes," she said, voice steady now. He leaned down and pressed his forehead lightly against hers. It wasn't urgent or forceful, just a quiet, grounding touch between two people who had learned to trust each other through silence, not promises. Outside, the wind shifted direction again, but neither of them looked away from the moment. The days after, when spring came, the land softened. Green patches returned to the valley, birds settled in the brush again, and the cold loosened its grip. Together they repaired the fence lines, expanded the garden, and rebuilt the small corral rail that had been leaning all winter. Jonas taught Tala how to check for storm signs in the clouds. Tala taught Jonas how to braid cord from softened plant fibers. They cooked together, walked the ridge together, shared quiet evenings near the stove. One morning, under a sky clear enough to show the first hints of spring warmth, Jonas stood with Tala on the porch. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She looked at him, surprised at the gesture. He wasn't a man of sudden movements, but she didn't let go. "Tala," he said, voice low, "I've lived alone a long time, and I thought that was how it was supposed to be." She waited. "But you changed that." Without trying, without asking. She stepped closer, her hand tightening around his. "I want this to be a home for both of us," he said. "If you'd be my wife." Tala's breath left her in a soft rush. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice clear. "I will." Jonas pulled her gently into his arms. No rush, no urgency, just a steady embrace, the kind that said everything without words. The cold world outside no longer felt empty. The cabin was no longer just shelter. It was theirs now, built from choice, trust, and the simple act of staying. Two lives that had been broken apart now stood together, not because fate forced them close, but because they had chosen each other and chose to stay.